Okay, everybody. This part of our class is going to talk about the federal bureaucracy. So remember, a bureaucracy is basically any type of organization that has some type of directive from the executive branch to operate. Whether it's the FBI, the CIA, Social Security, the Department of Veteran Affairs. These are all under the executive branch, and the president kind of acts as the CEO over the bureaucracy, and you could probably consider the bureaucracy to be like a business. They do a lot of customer service type things, and maybe at sometimes make policies. But when we talk about this, the elites within the bureaucracy, this usually refers to the bulk of the executive branch, whether it's federal, state, or local. We can have state bureaucracies as well. An example of a state bureaucracy may be something like the DMV. You know what I mean? Government office that provides some type of customer service to the people. A good idea to maybe look at and talk about when you think about the bureaucracy is some of the characteristics that it shares. There's a clear chain of command usually in the bureaucracy where you have if you're a worker, then you probably have a supervisor, then a manager, then a director, and then the head of the agency. There's usually going to be specific rules and regulations, and you can't really deviate from that. And there's a real rigidity in those rules and regulations where you can't go around them. Usually, the people that work there tend to have kind of an impersonality in executing tasks. Maybe not making conversation with you when you go there, just kind of things that are get you in and out of the place. We also have to adapt to the structure and the authority and rules to the organization's goals. So if we get some type of directive from the government or the executive offices, then you have to kind of put those into place. And you also need to maintain records and make sure you stick to the rules. That's probably the biggest thing within the bureaucracy. Because if you bend the rules for somebody, you have to do it for everybody. So that's kind of the idea there. You guys probably may be familiar with the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act was a reform that was put into place to kind of curb corruption a bit in government and to stop patronage. Remember, patronage is where you usually will have a person running for a mayoral candidate. It's usually more at it was more at the local levels than anything else, where you have a person that, in a sense, acts as the elected official, and then they give jobs to the supporters, right? And then the supporters, when they get paid for those jobs, they have to kick back a portion of their salary to the political party. That's where we kind of get the aspects of political machines. But the Pendleton Act made it so that you could only hire people based off of merit and not based off support of a candidate. Usually these people in the bureaucracy will have some type of organized expertise. And I used to work for the county of San Diego, and it's divided up into organizations, and these people that handle certain things usually really need to specialize in that. One example would be maybe the people that go out and check restaurants for cleanliness. Not anybody could do that. You need some type of training and education to do that. Usually, Congress and the president will give a directive to bureaucratic organizations to kind of get an idea of what they want to do, and in a sense also enforce that and kind of putting policy into place. So at times you may have not elected officials making policy decisions. At times, bureaucracies are powerful enough to have its own laws passed. An example may be something like the DEA or the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, or the Drug Enforcement Agency, which they have a lot of power and they can dictate, kind of laws and stuff like that. Some of these jobs within government involve unionization, and as we talked about in Chapter 4, Government employee unions tend to be really strong, and right now union membership has gone down, where we only have about 13% of the population belonging to some type of union. And the bureaucracy is very big because we can see that, usually that combines about 45% of our GDP, gross domestic product, how much revenue, how much money we take in, how much money is allocated to the budget. About 45% of that comes from the United States GDP. Now, if we look at the organization of the Washington bureaucracy, now the president will have his cabinet, and that cabinet will consist of secretaries of 15 executive departments, like the Department of Defense, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Homeland Security. They usually don't make policy, but they'll advise the president, right? You also have the National Security Council, which advises the president on military policy, security policy, domestic policy, and foreign policy. This is made up of the president, the VP, the Secretary of State. So right now that Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Treasury, all of these people are part of the National Security Council. We also have the Office of Management and Budget. This is the largest agency in the executive branch. They prepare the budget for the president and submit it to Congress. Any type of appropriation that Congress makes, meaning any type of money that Congress sets aside for a program, must be cleared by the OMB first. And the president has control over the bureaucracy according to Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, where that power granted gives the president the ability to preside over the bureaucracy and the federal budget. The Constitution will give the president the power to appoint all secretaries, undersecretaries, deputy secretaries, and most bureau chiefs. However, they have to be confirmed by the Senate. So the president makes about 2,500 appointments during their administration. Party control over the bureaucracy is particularly difficult after the opposition party has held Washington for a long time. And also you may have people that have an immense amount of power, like I talk about, and they act like czars, like I said, like the Food and Drug Administration, who has a lot of power, as we've seen through the vaccine stuff that has come up during the COVID pandemic, and maybe kind of the scheduling of drugs on the Controlled Substance Act that Nixon put into place has given those people some very immense powers here. The president exercises budgetary power over the bureaucracy through the OMB, and in a sense you can also do some aspects of what's called incremental budgeting. And the president relies on the OMB to kind of give him advice about the annual federal budget, and then he'll send it to Congress. Usually that begins more than a year before the start of the fiscal year. I believe the federal government's fiscal year is October to September. The state and the county is July to June. I'm pretty certain of that. But I'm not quite. I believe that the federal government is October to September. And what will happen is the Office of Management and Budget will consider all requests that departments and agencies make to fit them with the president's policy goals. The president his budget is sent to the House and Senate budget committees who draft a budget resolution for Congress. There'll be 13 appropriation bills that go through specialized appropriation subcommittees, and then Congress will prepare a reconciliation bill to reconcile the amount set by the budget resolutions and the amount set by the appropriations committee. So basically what they're doing is they're trying to make sure their numbers match. Simple as that, right? Sometimes we'll have shutdowns, and we've had a shutdown in the past, I think it was about 3 years ago, where the government didn't have enough funding to keep its doors open, so some people were put off work, or some people were also told to work, like TSA, the people that check at the airport. Some of them had to work even without being paid, but eventually these things will tend to get worked out, and people will get back pay if they're eligible for it. The president can veto appropriations bill, but not specific provisions of the bill. It's something kind of like the line item veto that we talked about during the presidential section. The line item veto was found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because it infringes on Congress's powers to make laws. But here in California, as part of the way that our California system is set up, the governor does have a line item veto ability here in California. Now, if we take a look at this, federal spending remains basically steady at about 20% of the GDP. 60% of federal spending is spent on entitlements, which is things like Social Security, Medicare, and so on. And there's questions from both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, on what to do with capping entitlements, meaning how much are we going to put limits on. But while they could probably agree that there should be caps, it's determining what those caps are is where we have the problems and, the contentious activity that happens in Congress. So usually the president has to, and Congress tend to try to balance the budget. Currently we're running a deficit. We're about $22 trillion in debt. And to give kind of an example of how that number corresponds with the real world, in order for us to get out of the debt, if the government would hypothetically ask us to contribute some type of donation, it would have to be about $46,000 per resident here in the U.S. to get rid of our debt. International investors will hold about 20% of that debt. And if you take the Intro to Political Science class, you're going to see a lot of that debt belongs to China. And that's one reason that we would never get into any type of war with China, because of, we rely on them for cheap labor. They hold a lot of our debt. And there's a formula for GDP. I don't expect you to know this, but just kind of know the generalities of GDP. Now, the federal government will finance itself through income tax, which is about 46%, Social Security payroll tax, which is about 32%, and corporate taxes. Social Security taxes are regressive, meaning that they capture a larger share of the income of lower income workers. And it's a flat percentage. Remember, we pay half and our employer pays half. And this is some notes I have here, not really anything too in depth. I'm not going to try to act like I know the federal income tax system. We're put into brackets, and it can be anywhere from 10 all the way up to 39% a tax. That may be changing with some of Biden's agenda. The IRS is obviously the entity that's responsible for that. Corporations can be taxed up to 35%, but they have a host of exemptions that might bring that all the way down to as low as 10%, right? Capital gains tax, or taxes that are made on investment, are taxed at about 15%. So say, for instance, you invested in a stock and that stock made money, then you pulled that money out. You may have to pay a capital gains tax on that. Now, there's also questions about regulations, and should we have regulations? Some of the criticisms of regulations is it prevents businesses from innovating. So a regulation might be something like the $15 an hour minimum wage that they've been trying to fight for. So one thing that we can also kind of talk about is when we have regulations, usually they are passed on to us as an employee or as a consumer. So say, for instance, if you've noticed in some restaurants, food prices have gone up, it's probably trying to capture the money that's being lost by offering more wages, especially with a lot of these organizations having problems filling positions. Okay, don't worry about iron triangles. We're not going to get too in-depth in that. And, regulations, it's still a very controversial subject among people. Should we hamper businesses by putting, possible fines that may be laid on them if they commit some type of malfeasance or something. Um, but I think it's also necessary to prevent abuse as well, whether it's abuse to the worker, abuse to the consumer, or even abuse to the environment. So we have things like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which looks at people that may hypothetically be discriminated against work. They could file a complaint with the government, and the government will investigate that. And if there's any type of wrongdoing by the employer, there might be a fine, and also there might be a lawsuit involved. OSHA is another really famous one. OSHA protects people's safety at work, and if there's some type of workplace accident, it has to be reported to OSHA, and OSHA does an investigation if they think it's necessary. The EPA is another one, Environmental Protection Agency. So those are all activist regulations. Um, you know, uh, Regulation generates about $4 trillion each year. So it's definitely a revenue generator, right? And it's paid for by businesses, employees, and consumers. So I really wanted to kind of reiterate that. And some of the complaints that we talked about as far as excessive regulations is that it might increase costs to businesses and consumers. It might hamper innovation and productivity, reduces competition, and doesn't necessarily weigh the cost of complying against the benefits of society. Um, Taking money out of businesses might hurt others in the long run, and we definitely will pay for it on the other end. Um, but it's one of those quagmires, like we said, like it says up there on the top of the slide, where how should we handle this? And is too much regulation a bad thing or a good thing? It's just a matter of ideological perspective. Okay, so that's what we got as far as a bureaucracy. So, um, the kind of corresponding with this is, remember the federal bureaucracy is going to be a major base of power in the U.S. because they act independently at times. All right, so just kind of remember that. Okay, thanks a lot.